let us center ourselves, inviting mind, body, and spirit into this space made sacred by our presence. Let this be a time of reflection. Let this be a time of celebration. Let this be a time of worship. Come, let us worship. Please rise in body and/or in spirit to sing together our opening hymn, number 190, Light of Ages.
Violet Turner was a longtime member of this church who wrote poems for 50 years and published her book at the age of 85. If there are bells, let them be rung. If there are words of joy, let them be shouted. Rejoice, rejoice, give thanks. Give thanks for that first cell that chose to join with cell, bold for the human venture, the jetting sperm, the microscopic egg, the fetal fish swimming within the hospitable womb. Give thanks for these and for the skeleton that hides the heart behind its latticed ribs and shelters in its hollow skull the brain, plump on its armored stem. Give thanks for body's form, for gift of breath. Above all, praise the cell's arithmetic that adds the body's parts to make a self that's greater than their sum, that hears and sees and knows it hears and sees and knows itself alive aware of joy. Death after such awareness is no pain, and to have lived is blessing. Sing, give thanks.
As Harold and Martha Quayle come forward to light our chalice, symbol of our shared faith, please rise in body and or in spirit to speak together the words printed in your order of celebration. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. Please.
Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears, while we also sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary, hard
We gather, as we always gather, in sacred space, a place set aside as a sanctuary amid the many challenges of life, a center from which we may gather strength to face these challenges with courage, grace, and hope. In this time of reflection, we lift up those in our community who are living through the small and extraordinary milestones of life. May all who gather here be held in the embrace of this community of care. We hold in our hearts victims of gun violence and the awful tragedies of this week. For our friends and for all the joys and sorrows that remain unspoken in our hearts, let us turn to the peace and solace of prayer, first in words, then in silence, and then in song.
Eternal God, we pray in many ways. We pray in a world of violence and hate. We pray for the power of love and wisdom to give strength for our prayer for peace. We pray in hope that we may fill our days with the best that life has to offer, that there is success in what we attempt, and joy in achievement, and fun in living. For all this, we hope. We pray in celebration of the community we are building and the strength of just being together, of making music and listening to it, of stretching our minds, reflecting on our experience, and sharing what life has brought us. We pray in gratitude for life itself, for a new day and a new season, for living in a place of beauty, for all that we have brought and are bringing to each other, for the love we have known, and the realization that in spite of all, life is good. Life is good.
deep in ourselves, resides the religious impulse. Out of the passions of our clay does it rise. Yet religion is not a froth of emotion, nor a pure, detached deduction of the head. We have religion when we stop deluding ourselves that we are self-sufficient, self-sustaining, or self-derived, and when we come to look upon life as something more than merely a biological twitter. We have religion when we keep faith in life and in its inherent goodness, when we hold some hope beyond the present, some self-respect beyond our failures, and when we remember that there is something unique in us called, in ancient language, the image of God, and in modern thought, our freedom or dignity. We have religion when our hearts are capable of leaping up at beauty, when our ambition takes fire as if some inner spark were aflame, when our nerves are edged by some dream in the heart. We have religion when we feel the urge to be our best, to seek well-doing, and when we sense that ultimately life is not a trap and the business of living is not a farce. We have religion when we have an abiding gratitude for all that we have received, including our own life and a universe to sustain it, and when we refuse to accept the gift of life as our automatic right, but seek rather to express our gratitude in the quality of our life and the depth of our compassion.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone, way up in the heavenly land, way up in the heavenly land. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
Thank you. Ralph Norman Helverson was actually called to be the first minister of this church, and family considerations made him feel that he could not move to Bethesda then. He was one of my first mentors. As I was a student at the First Church in Cambridge, and he was called to be minister there. And I find I don't have the second page. Suzanne? Do you? Thank you. We have religion when we look upon people with all their failings and still find them good. When we look beyond people to the grandeur in nature and the purpose in our own hearts, which inspire us to acquit ourselves well. We have religion when we shoulder responsibility for ourselves, and when we really care about those around us, when we refuse to accept as final the usual defeats of life, and rise to meet fear with courage, danger with daring, and despair with faith. We have religion when we have done all that we can and then in confidence entrust ourselves to the life that is larger than ourselves, this marvelous order that sustains us, aware that this world is not our private ordeal or pleasure, but that life will go on long after we have departed this temporal scene. Ralph Norman Helverson.
Our offering is an invitation to demonstrate willingly a commitment to our mission and our ministry, and to the common values expressed in Unitarian Universalist principles. Our offering reminds us that our congregation belongs to us, to each of us as well as to the whole. It is an extension of our gratitude for our spiritual home, where we are invited to be who we are as we are, to lead lives of joy, hope, integrity, and service. It is also a way that we live out our mission of working to build a more just world. This morning, 100% of our plate will be shared to assist the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. Thank you for your generosity.
Lovely. I love this pulpit. We all want to be cool. I think of the woman who had lived in Westport, Connecticut for many years, but she'd never seen Paul Newman, who also lived there. And one day she went down to Baskin-Robbins for an ice cream cone, and as she was standing at the counter, the door opened and Paul Newman walked in. Well, she was determined to be cool. She paid for her ice cream cone and left the store. And as she was walking up the street, she realized she did not have her ice cream cone. She went back into the store and said, I paid for an ice cream cone, but I didn't get it. And Paul Newman stepped forward and he said, yes, you did. I saw you put it in your purse. I thought I could get away with that old one again. In the summer of 1793, a young Irishman named Arthur Wesley burned his violin. He did it with his own hands. As a boy, he had sat enraptured while his father played. As an older boy, he had learned to play for himself. And indeed, music seemed to be his outstanding talent. Making music was one of the things he still enjoyed at the age of 25 when he burned his violin. In 1798, the family name was changed from Wesley back to Wellesley, as it had been for several years. In 1809, he became Viscount Wellington. And in 1815, he defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. He became the Duke of Wellington, the most influential and respected Briton of his time, until his death in 1853. He was a younger son in a family with a great history and great dreams, but insufficient present resources. He went to Eton for a while, but he was withdrawn by his family to make way for a promising brother. He was 16 when his mother wrote, I vow to God I don't know what I shall do with my awkward son Arthur. He is food for powder and nothing more. That would seem to be a rather detached maternal view. The army was seen as the last refuge for square pegs. Arthur joined a Highland regiment on his 18th birthday. In the next few years, he returned to Ireland, led the life of a young officer, playing cards at certain clubs and being entertained in the great houses. He proposed marriage to a young lady, but was turned down. He was a bit of a dilettante. But something coalesced within him in 1793 and caused him suddenly to leave behind the card playing in the Dublin clubs, the parties and dances, the long walks, poetry in his life. And he burned his violin. We can only speculate why. He was to devote himself thereafter to regimental accounts and a single-minded concentration on his military career. Perhaps the violin was too soft and seductive a pastime. Perhaps it seemed not virile enough in that long-gone time for a soldier. Perhaps it opened his imagination too easily to fancies which must be guarded against, closed out. Perhaps it made him vulnerable. There are so many ways to feel vulnerable, and to feel vulnerable is to be vulnerable. From the small child's terror at being abandoned, to the high school student who's not very quick and who sits for years through certain classes in abject terror that he may be called on any minute and made to feel a fool. There's vulnerability. All around us, there are tests to be passed, suggested tests that the culture makes optional, but that we impose upon ourselves as requirements. Will I make the team? Can I get dates? Can I have a happy marriage? Can I make money? Can I get elected to something? Am I liberal enough, committed enough, potent, fun, loving enough? Can I stay young, keep my looks, stay healthy? Can I keep this marriage going? Do I look as old as I am? Can I live forever? Can I face an operation? Can I have a few more years? Can I die? I mean, do it right, with some dignity left. I think that every person who joins a church is acknowledging vulnerability. If that belief is true, and there are some who would debate it, then it diagrams the greatest danger that churches face, and also their greatest strength. All because we all handle vulnerabilities so variously. Wellington burned his violin. Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy both concealed the extent of their physical handicaps early in their political careers, knowing that the voting public must have unqualified confidence in their strength before it would entrust them to high office. Later, their vulnerability became part of their appeal once we knew how strong they were. But it must never define them. Too frequently, our vulnerabilities do become the definition of our existence. The physical handicaps are the most graphic. Abby Donovan is a woman who had been crippled for 25 years. And then she wrote, "I have acted as the world wanted me to act, as a cripple. Now I am sick of being a supplicant. It is my responsibility, if you care, not to define my fears, hopes, successes, and failures by my cane, crutches, or braces. It's my struggle in any case to keep alive in myself the knowledge that I am a full-fledged human being in spite of society's embarrassment, distaste, fear, ignorance, and misconception, not to mention its ability not even to see me. Becoming visible, making you see me as a person, not a cripple, is very risky indeed. But I freely choose it now. So says Abby Donovan, as she risks a new kind of exposure for a new kind of living. Some kinds of vulnerability are merely well-established nonsense. In 1861, Elizabeth Garrett was excluded from the program of medical studies at Middlesex Hospital in London by a petition signed by 43 of her fellow students. They complained that the appearance of young females as passive spectators, they already had nurses, in the operating theater is an outrage on our natural instincts and feelings, and it is calculated to destroy those sentiments of respect and admiration with which the opposite sex is treated by right-minded men. Elizabeth Garrett overcame that particular vulnerability and went on to become England's first woman doctor. But we still have a great deal of well-established nonsense prevailing about what women ought to be allowed to do. Run for president? Nah. And what black people ought to be allowed to do, and Mexicans, and homosexual people, and transgender people, and crippled people, and poor people, and people who are not emotionally stable. And the list could go on and eventually include us all. And the result is that we spend, many of us, years establishing a personhood in spite of, laying scar tissue over the vulnerability until we discover, if we're lucky, that that's not what being a person is all about. It was all a mistake. Our real lives are elsewhere. But those vulnerabilities can get to be a habit. We should not be left to fight the well-established nonsense alone. This is a superb function for a church, to be a quiet stronghold of human good sense in the sea of well-established nonsense. And some people think that a church can do this if it would only practice what it preaches. But I'm inclined to think that a church does it more strikingly in the way it treats the people who are in trouble with what the church stands for. It's tough enough to be an ordinary sinner in the congregation of the righteous. One should not have to be made an example of to show that the church is pure and righteous. I remember a young lady saying to me, "It seemed a little funny in church last Sunday. There we all were, practically in the same row. The man I'm living with, and his wife, and my husband, and her lawyer. And I thought, that church must be doing something right. Perhaps you remember that I said that joining a church was an acknowledgement of vulnerability. I wanted that to nag you a bit before I dealt with it. There's so many kinds of vulnerability. Other people's and our own stereotypes, our weakness, dependence, anxiety, innocence, naivete. Joining a church to me seems equivalent to saying, life and death together are more than I can deal with alone. People who have closed off their vulnerabilities, like Wellington burning his violin, or people whose whole life force must be channeled into some great end, Marie Curie or Arturo Toscanini. These people seldom have time for a church which might threaten their invulnerability. I say that not as a moral judgment, but a simple observation. They have a different way of coping. But some of us come to church seeking greater strength in our weakness, and we come to find out who we really are. Or we put up a great show of being strong and powerful and really in command. But at some point, we need to acknowledge to ourselves that, like everyone else, we need help because we are hanging on sometimes by fragile threads, because ordinary living demands an awful lot from us. Until we can acknowledge weakness, we are really cut off from humanity. And it is pretty cold and lonely out there among the saints. However various are the chinks in our armor, and however each of us may cherish the uniqueness of our own Achilles heel, there are two kinds of vulnerability which none of us escape: mortality, morality. The awareness that we will not live forever should be the beginning of religion, our mandate to make each day count. The church is where we turn when we lose the people we love, and the place where we are challenged to deal with the anxiety of knowing that we are mortal. We too will die. That is the ultimate vulnerability. But along the way, we struggle with the many questions of our morality. Am I good enough? We're currently going through the spectacle of our greatest morality show, the presidential election, in which the candidates present morality lectures, otherwise known as campaign speeches. But this is not where you and I have learned most of what we know about morality. Not from the great golden voices of truth and the right, or even of the way and the light. We learned it from the people we encountered when we were most vulnerable, when we were weak or lonely or guilty or scared. And some of them held us and still hold us in their love. And we don't have to deserve them. There they are. And others were cold and demanding and made us measure up in ways we never knew that we could. And they made us stronger, less vulnerable. When I was driving at 45 miles an hour on a dark street and I crashed into another car, I did not know right away what had caused the accident. I wondered whether I had dozed off. Suppose someone else was injured. If I had caused this, how would I live with myself? I did not find out for some days that it was a woman who had backed out of her driveway into my path. Meanwhile, I concluded that whatever I had done, if I could find forgiveness in my church, I would be able to forgive myself. So here we are, vulnerable and aspiring. We come together as a church. And we sit in those chairs and we sometimes look so good and wise and mentally healthy and so I'm okay, you're okay, singing those hymns that I wonder what I'm doing here. I know I'm not put together that well. And if you are, then I don't belong here. America and most Americans are coming to another stage of a century and a half of learning what it means to be a person of color in the United States. And now, what it means to be a policeman in the United States. Those are two kinds of vulnerability, and there's a third kind we all share, because we have all some responsibility for having reached this stage as a nation through our racism, our denial, our refusal to pay attention. This may be why some of us are uncomfortable coming to church, because the events of recent months and days, killings of several black men by white policemen, was followed by a peaceful demonstration in Dallas, which gave a black former soldier a chance to kill 5 white policemen and injure several others before he was killed. We live mostly sheltered lives in a violent world, if we need to find ways to deal with the violence and not just shut it out, then church is the place to begin. Church is where we try to deal with the big questions, where we help each other to get engaged, where we begin to believe that we can make a difference. It all comes out of puzzle. We join the church because we're vulnerable. And the church should help us to turn some of that weakness into strength. But it can only do that if it remains vulnerable, compromised, and strong enough not to have to always be right. And we can only be good for each other if we keep some of that honest sense of who we really are. Suppose Arthur Wesley hadn't burned his violin. Would he have become the great general? Would Napoleon have emerged the victor at Waterloo? Would our whole history be changed? Would we be speaking French? I don't know. Maybe he had to do that. But to you, my friend, and all my friends, don't put the match to that violin. I'll need your music more than your strategy. And sometimes we need each other to be strong. But we always need each other to be vulnerable. Let us sing. 293. Remember who you are. Remember what you love. Remember what is sacred. Remember what is true. Remember that each of us will die and that today, this day, is a gift. And that's why we call it the present. Amen.